Hi everyone, this is Miss Peer Editor, and today we are decoding the SAT science passage in the reading portion of the exam using step-by-step annotations. Before we jump in, be sure to subscribe and check out my Medium, TikTok, and Instagram pages with my handle @MissPeerEditor for more helpful content. Here's the first part of a passage that was provided by the College Board for a practice SAT exam. I'll put the link to this full exam in the description below. Take a minute to pause this video and read this excerpt. Okay, let's get started. It's a good exercise to jot down the purpose of each paragraph because a lot of multiple choice questions ask you to identify that. The purpose of this paragraph is to introduce the first study that is discussed in the passage, and this study examines the effect of wayfinding or navigating on the brains of taxi drivers. When you read the first and last sentence of a paragraph, that will give you a pretty good idea of what the purpose is because those sentences will introduce the main idea and show what the author wants you, the reader, to take away. Additionally, when we're reading a passage, we want to gather as much information as we can about the time period, place, and the people involved. Right off the bat, we can see that the events of this passage take place in 2000, which is relatively recent, and our main person of interest is Eleanor Maguire, who's a neuroscientist or an expert on the human brain. This underlined portion describes the methodology of Maguire's study. A lot of science passages read like condensed versions of scientific papers in which you might see an abstract, introduction, methods, results, and discussion section. So just like an article in a scientific journal, this passage describes how the study was conducted and what the conclusions were. The conclusion of this study was that the act of navigating enlarged the hippocampus for cabbies, so it changed their brain structure. The next paragraph shows how the first study contradicts a long-standing consensus, and that is evident in the last sentence of the paragraph, which says, Maguire's study suggested the old inherited wisdom was simply not true. In the first sentence of this paragraph, we can see the definition of a scientific phenomenon called neuroplasticity. The next few sentences explain that while people thought before that the brain's physical structure cannot change, it actually can. If we read the phrase basic anatomical structure, the word basic in this context means foundational, fundamental, or underlying because this refers to the brain structure that people start out with as adults. The following paragraph introduces the second study, which examines the brain structure and activity of mental athletes who are also referred to as memorizers. So the subjects of this study are different from the subjects of the first study, which analyzed taxi drivers. These two new characters, Elizabeth Valentine and John Wilding, are important because they will add their subject matter expertise on memory to Eleanor Maguire's existing knowledge. The last sentence of this paragraph provides the central question that the researchers are trying to answer in the second study, and this transitions nicely into the next paragraph, which describes the findings of the second study. This paragraph describes the expectations that the researchers, Maguire, Valentine, and Wilding, had for their study. Like the cabbies, the mental athletes were expected to have different brain structures from the average person. However, the second study refutes this expectation because no significant structural differences were apparent. The author of this passage sums up this reality using simple, practical diction when he says, the memory champs weren't smarter and they didn't have special brains. And this really shows that the intended audience of this passage is the ordinary person who probably doesn't have that much exposure to neuroscience beforehand. Therefore, the author is using simple language that anyone can understand. Here are the remaining paragraphs in the passage. Please pause this video and read it over. Okay, let's jump back in. The purpose of this paragraph is to highlight one finding that distinguishes mental athletes from others, and this purpose is evident in the first few words of this paragraph, which say, "But there was one telling difference between the brains of mental athletes and the control subjects." Coordinating conjunctions such as but, yet, or so, as well as the transition words such as however, similarly, or therefore, can hint to us what the purpose of the paragraph is. The main point this paragraph is trying to highlight is that the mental athletes use certain regions of the brain more than the ordinary individual or control subjects. So there's a difference in the brain region use rather than their brain structure. The next paragraph raises thought-provoking questions about a surprising finding, and that is apparent in the very first word, which is surprisingly. Drawing similarities between mental athletes and cabbies, the author is now tying the two studies together. Both mental athletes and cabbies use the same parts of the brain for visual memory and spatial navigation. The questions at the end of this paragraph pique the reader's curiosity and smoothly transition into an explanation of why mental athletes need these specific skills. The last paragraph explains the reason behind the surprising finding. The author connects the two skills mentioned before, visual memory and spatial navigation, to information, which is what the athletes need to memorize. In the last few sentences, words such as automatically and inborn talent are contrasted with training and practice to prove that training, not innate abilities, cause this unusual brain activity. Thus, anyone can achieve what mental athletes have achieved because they have trained extensively, and they weren't born with these specific abilities. Let's sum up some key aspects of this passage. In terms of structure, we have 2 paragraphs that focus on the first study, 3 paragraphs on the second study, and 2 final paragraphs that connect both studies. Our main characters are Eleanor Maguire, the original neuroscientist who coordinates the first study, and Elizabeth Valentine and John Wilding, who team up with Maguire for the second study. Let's summarize the objective of the studies or experiments. The first study analyzes the effect of wayfinding on cabbies' brains, whereas the second study analyzes whether mental athletes had a different brain structure or used their brains differently. The methodology for both studies was the same because the researchers conducted MRI scans of both cabbies and mental athletes. What were the conclusions? The first study showed that cabbies' brain structures were different than usual. On the other hand, the second study proved that mental athletes used parts of their brains for spatial navigation and visual memory more than usual. Some scientific jargon or scientific terms that we read were hippocampus, neuroplasticity, fMRIs, and visual memory. And while this particular passage doesn't have any graphs, charts, or images, many science passages on the SAT and other exams do have these. If you encounter these, you should ask yourself, what trends can you see? What predictions can you make? And is the passage consistent or inconsistent with the data? Thanks for watching. In the comments, let me know what video topic you want to see next. Check out the description for helpful links, and remember to subscribe and tap the bell to receive notifications whenever I post a new video. I'll see you next time.